Kaiser Guntram's early rule was generally uneventful. A quiet child raised by tutors and courtiers, he proved strange and private. When the time came, he got married even before his regency ended, but it was not his decision. He was made to marry by his regent and tutor in order to conceal the fact that Guntram was a homosexual. As unpopular as he already was, this news escaping beyond the walls of the court would devastate his reputation and likely jeopardize the throne he sat upon. There were those few at court, however, that supported him regardless, but whether this was out of a plain utilitarianism as the rightful heir, or in the outcast spirit of the Volksreich, these figures wouldn't say. Or rather, they would say whatever suited them best. Regardless, he had a son in 1323 named Siegfried. Whether this was to quell suspicion or solely out of duty, it is unclear. In 1324, the Magyarország declared war for another Italian province. Not particularly good at war or anything else, Guntram appeased them as his father did, further severing Rome from the rest of the Volksreich. Due to this aggression, Kaiser Guntram decided to propose a betrothal between his infant son Siegfried and Ludmilla, the young daughter of Tsar Yefim Blatomil. There was much deliberation, as the two empires had been recent enemies, rivals of the worst sort. Once a full month had passed of argument and concession, certain things became clear. Russia, while ascendant, could not defeat the Volksreich yet. The Magyarország threatened them both, and finally, an alliance would secure their shared border completely. As such, the Tsar accepted his act of pioneering diplomacy, and they forged an alliance that day, one of the first of its kind in Europe. Combined, their armies numbered at over 90,000 men. This threatened the Magyars, and not wanting to tempt fate, they decided to direct their focus south once more. In 1324, as the Aequids grew ever weaker, beset on all sides with only their neutered army of light to protect them, the mighty Fatimids, famous for their sheer stability, declared a jihad against the Aequids. Meanwhile, many of the strongest empires in Europe began to copy their famously stable system, which, ironically, the Fatimids copied from the Romans and Islamized. The courts of Europe adopted it, re-Christianized it, and moved from feudal empires to truly imperial systems. This system was so stable because it robbed the nobility of their sway over the monarch, while also streamlining the tax system and facilitating a well-trained standing army. The Volksreich, however, remained feudal, plagued with constant infighting of the sort the others did not have to deal with. Artifacts of the crude peasant tools which built it lay everywhere, frustrating the flow of power to the crown via thousands of governing traditions and folkways. Kaiser Guntram, however, was impressed with the progress and new ideas being explored abroad, deciding to make it his goal to be a different kind of ruler, bringing his people boldly into the future and without their consent. In 1325, he proposed the absolute crown authority law, utilizing the deep pockets inherited from his father's wise administration to richly pay off electors to vote away their say in the matter. In 1326, the jihad against the Aequids was a success, establishing the Islamic Sultanate of Bulgar and splitting the Aequid Khanate in half. Meanwhile, Kaiser Guntram forced through a wide array of sweeping reforms by exploiting the channels of corruption that had tunneled through the foundations of the empire for centuries. Chief among these was the wildly unpopular King's Peace, forbidding vassals to fight amongst each other and making the heavy yoke of the Kaiser impossible to scramble out from beneath. Meanwhile, in 1328, the Pope called a crusade for Al-Andalus in order to support and accelerate the reconquête. On the 23rd of August, 1329, a revolt league made up of nobles angered at the reforms demanded Guntram reduce the crown authority. Guntram reminded them that there were not supposed to be any Volkish nobles in the first place, and that he would ignore them totally. Upon receiving this slap in the face, war was declared. The Tyrannis War, as it was called, seemed initially impossible for Guntram to win. Most of his vassals had turned on him, and if that was all he had to go on, he was doomed. However, he had money, and a great deal of it. His father's general inaction benefited him here, with all that wealth. He was thusly enabled to purchase the largest mercenary army Europe had perhaps ever seen, outnumbering the nobility and dwarfing even the entire army of the neighboring Magyarország. The rebels made initial advances, but by the time the mercenaries of Europe and beyond made it out to the court of Guntram, this progress was reversed. His army of fortune, in a series of devastating defeats, marched the rebels all the way back to Rome, the ensuing battle over in a matter of hours. As such, the Tyrannis War was won by Kaiser Guntram in 1331. However, because of the protracted retreat, Emma the Nun, who was the true genius behind gathering information about the Kaiser and the movements of his mercenaries, escaped into the Alps, and from her sequestered monastery in the mountains began to plot. Just as the last man had returned to his country of origin, Emma the Nun started another revolt in November of 1331, this time to overthrow the Kaiser outright. Her call to the Second Tyrannis War was met with a resounding response, this time from the surviving revolt leaders and a great mass of peasantry, some wielding pitchforks and trowels. Guntram was enraged at this, and though he wanted to deprive Europe of its mercenaries once more, he couldn't afford to. A certain greater portion of the nobility, some of those siding with him in the prior war, and others since defeated by him and sworn to loyalty bound by honor or familial hostage, rallied beneath his banner. The First Tyrannis War was characterized by a certain nobility of character. All those involved fought well and bravely, even the hired men embodied a warrior spirit in most encounters. It would soon be romanticized, and even paint the Kaiser in a better light in some retellings. However, the Second Tyrannis War was characterized by its regular brutality. Skirmishes, a few thousand men deep, cropped up in nearly every major city and hundreds of towns. Marauding gangs of local levied men abused any commoner they could find, assuming them to be rebels in every case, brutalizing, raping, and pillaging their whole way through. In turn, roving bands of peasants met their town guard in the fields and tore them to shreds, ruining the crop and sometimes feeding them alive to pigs. There was no great battle to define the Second Tyrannis War like there was the Battle of the Rubicon the first. This would simply be years of tiresome and insufferable gore. Emma the Nun, planning an organized assault on Schwarzburg, where she hoped to find the Kaiser, tried to enlist the help of the Albigensian Church. She was wise for having noted their hatred of the crown, though she was unwise to trust them. The Patriarch at the time, Patriarch Arnold, agreed to join her plan and lend his support. However, when the time came, the Kaiser had been notified by the Church of their plot. As the assault was duly repelled, an army of 20,000 found Emma the Nun's monastery, and she was burned alive before the eyes of her commanders, the building itself soon to follow. The rest of them were brought into the dungeons where Kaiser Guntram could toy with their sanity as he pleased. In this dark way, the Second Revolt was won by 1334, and it was then time in his eyes to resume the hardline reforms which put him in this position at all. Seeing his intention to become more stringent and resolute in his resolve to achieve these ends, by September there was another revolt, this time one whose aims were to gain independence altogether. This Third Tyrannis War was the shortest, as the rebels used mercenaries to support their position. After the first few battles of an assuredly bloody war, Kaiser Guntram invited their leader, Duke Reiner Jorvikmund, to discuss the situation diplomatically, feigning an exhaustion of war and a worry that the conflicts would never truly end. However, once enticed and at his table, Kaiser Guntram was able to poison this leader's wine, thus killing him and ending the war before it even began. In 1335, he had to assassinate another aspiring rebel, managing to do so before the Hydra could spring another head. It was clear that he had alienated his vassals, and in order to survive, he would need to become a spider, poisoning people in their sleep, wrapping them up in a web which traps them in doom, and saves the Volksreich from total collapse, while the Kaiser's grip only grows ever tighter. He gave independence to a single county duke who was too hard to kill, only to plan on conquering him later. A much-needed expulsion, purging the next aspiring revolt leader so the head of the snake is distracted by their new freedom. It was around this time that Guntram became very violent, despite his cold face presented to all he met. Whenever his son was near, he would vent upon him, beating him for slights and misbehaviors, and many feared the boy would die. But courtiers who tried to shield him from his father's wrath were buried alive. Kaiser Guntram also became publicly unfaithful to his wife, dressing his lovers in her clothes and parading them about the castle. His wife would leap from the highest point of the castle, unable to live with the shame. In November, Kaiser Guntram moved to the capital from Schwarzburg to Stettin in the far north. He felt eyes on him everywhere as he tried to drag the realm into what he perceived to be the only way forward. This relocation was a symbol of his dedication to the cause. In 1336, he came down with food poisoning and was bedridden as a result. The tissue on his face began to fester, and his court physician had to remove the worst of it, mutilating him. From that point on, he wore a mask and only got more vindictive. On the 4th of April 1336, the Aikids lost their imperial title, being relegated to the equivalent of a kingdom, and only faced further decay from there. By December, the mighty Aikids had been completely consumed by the surrounding kingdoms, save for one sand pit near the Black Sea. Their Khan Mangliik, looked out over the waters he once owned, and dreamt of what would have happened had the Mongols not come. The Mongols, now calling themselves the Khorasani, had largely converted to Islam during this period. On the 28th of August 1338, a revolt league which wished to overthrow Kaiser Guntram declared itself in open rebellion to the crown, initiating the Fourth Tyrannis War. Hiltebrant the Confessor led an army almost twice the size of the crown's forces against Kaiser Guntram. Many said that this was his deserved end in light of how he treated everybody around him. However, in the mind of Kaiser Guntram, all those eyes watching him now had faces, and could be found and killed. He could close those eyes forever. Ruthlessly, he set his men upon the Revolt League, throwing as much human suffering at the enemy as he could. Though it seemed certain that Hildebrand would win, and there was even a time where Guntram once ruled none of his own cities, he came back from the brink by confiscating a great deal of church property for the hiring of mercenaries. From the precipice of death, he tore his enemies to shreds, scaled castle walls himself, some say even communing with the devil for power. Through whatever force he was able to overcome those who would overthrow him, he did. On the 2nd of December 1340, the revolt leaders, Hiltebrand, Imo, and Othelia, were torn from their camps and imprisoned to be used by the Kaiser. It was this day that he earned the title of the Monster. He cut off Hiltebrand's nose, as well as tarred and feathered him, and fit a bucket of rats upon his stomach, but removed them before they could chew through. Guntram gave Imo 50 lashes, gouged his eye out, and tarred and feathered him also. Finally, he gave Othelia 50 lashes, amputated her leg, and tarred and feathered her as well. He then threw them all in the oubliette to be kept alive in the darkness for many grueling years. Once the Fourth Tyrannis War was thoroughly rebuffed, none would dare oppose him. As such, Kaiser Guntram then set back about forcing his imperial reforms through. On the 20th of July 1341, Siegfried had a son who he was forced to name after his father, Guntram II, and in 1341 a revolt league had formed to put him on the throne upon deposing the monster, but that was soundly put down to a preponderance of spies that had infiltrated the rebels in their channels of communication. In 1343, an outbreak of smallpox led to Guntram the Monster gathering up many hundreds of cats to have them drowned, hoping to quell the disease. This was, except for one, which he kept and called Mittens. When the Albigensian Church declared war on the foul warlock, as they called him, they were met with their usual swift end, but this caused the monster to beat his court chaplain near to death, putting the church off the idea of a war for a long while. In 1345, he expelled the Jews from the Volksreich because he thought he heard one of the Jews in his court plotting against him. This unpopular move devastated the wealth of the realm, but he cared not. On the 6th of May, 1346, Guntram's former sister-in-law, Kuka, tried to poison him, but when he found out, he strangled her to death. A daughter was born to Siegfried in 1347, named Volsana. In 1348, the monster hired a witch to become his court physician in exchange for a small vial of his blood. Finally, in 1350, Kaiser Guntram the Monster finally enacted his greatest reform, the imperial administration. Absolute power now rested with the crown, and many would say that it was with Kaiser Guntram the Monster that the peasant traditions, the legacy of Amadeus in welcoming all the outcasts and respecting his vassals all as equals, would ultimately die. The monster had remade the Volksreich in his own image, leaving behind rivers of blood and mountains of skulls, and trod upon the very institutions that led to his adoption from that Schwarzburg orphanage all those years ago. In 1350, a second son named Walram was born to Siegfried. Siegfried's wife, Princess Ludmilla, died in childbirth at the age of 31, thus dissolving the alliance between the Volksreich and the Rus. By 1351, Kaiser Guntram the Monster became bedridden, and when Siegfried came to his bedside, promising to take care of him and nurse him back to health, he tried to hit him with his bedside cane. All of this, too, despite only being 44. In 1354, in an event that was truly confusing, the overshadowed Albigensian crusade for Bulgar was a success, driving out the Muslims there and establishing an Albigensian kingdom in the east under a former courtier of the Volksreich. This created an Albigensian bridge where one could travel from the Netherlands to the Caucasus and be in the lands of Cathar kings the whole time. In 1359, Kaiser Guntram the Monster reported hearing the voice of Satan in his head at times. On the 3rd of February 1359, Kaiser Guntram the Monster died of an infection of his face wounds. A hated, vicious man who lived up to his title of the Monster, not even women and children were safe from his grasp. But that's not how he started out. He began a high-minded young man beset on all sides by enemies who hated him for a litany of things that defined him. In the end, they drove him mad, but there was always some question if that wasn't there from the start. Regardless, he accomplished things none thought possible, dismantling the traditions of the von Bauer line and forcing the Volksreich to join the rest of Europe by bringing the mechanisms which brought him to the throne in the first place to tatters. Though the empire stood, the dream of the peasants' kingdom was no more, and Guntram, the Monster, killed it.